Great stories happen to those who can tell them. Today, with me, I have Vipul Agarwal, who is a seasoned agile practitioner with over 20 years of experience in consulting, business analysis, and product management. He is a vivid writer, and his articles has been published in many international magazines and portals. He is a mentor and a coach who was also a visiting faculty in one of the top B schools, Symbiosis. Welcome to Be a Rapid Chat, Vipul.
Thank you, Vikas. It's a pleasure.
Here are questions, Vipul. The first one, what is your favorite pastime when you're really not working?
So you see, I love watching sports. Particularly cricket, football, tennis. I also love to watch athletics events, and I believe that there's so much to learn from sports personals.
Mhm. Excellent. So, Vipul, if you have to go back into your memory lane and tell me of one learning you got from anyone that struck with you the most, what is it and why is it has struck with you?
So I think the most important learning that has struck with me is not to say yes to everything.
Mhm.
I think one needs to really analyze, the feasibility of the request on various parameters before you actually accept that request. And that also leads to, one of the most important, but also the most difficult art to master, and that is
Mhm.
how to say no. So that has been really big learning for me.
Excellent. I'm sure everybody can relate to that a lot. Now, here's your next question. If we have to describe a relation between story and a user in one sentence, what would that be?
So I would say a user is the one who can narrate the most accurate and convincing story.
Mhm. Excellent. I'm sure. So that leads to me this last question that I really tempted to ask
Mhm.
after hearing your last response, especially. Can anyone really write appealing user stories, or is it a mastery that is difficult to attain?
So writing a user story, in my view, is both art and science,
Mhm.
and you need to practice, and practice to really attain the mastery of writing a polling user story. The more user stories you write, the better you get in that.
Mhm. Excellent. I'm sure everybody would want to learn a lot more from you on that topic. So this is great, Vipul. So to everyone, please ensure to register for the session that Vipul is going to conduct for the IIBA India, which is happening on the 17th of July at 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time to learn about how to write compelling user stories. Vipul, thank you once again for this wonderful short rapid chat.
Thank you.
Looking forward to your session.
Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, very good evening. I hope you are doing well and staying safe. Welcome to today's session on writing compelling user stories. I am Pritesh Kumar Khandelwal, your host and coordinator for the session. My background of 9 plus years has been focused on Salesforce CRM domain product releases using both traditional waterfall SDLC and agile methodologies as part of end-to-end quality engineering. In today's competitive and fast-moving digital world, capturing customer-centric transformation requirements necessitate special skills which help business users and engineering teams to easily understand and manage quality of product deliverables goals as well as reducing rework efforts on the same requirements to maintain product quality. Writing user stories, is it an art or a science? To help to understand the best practices in creating user stories, converting them from average to excellent, and do it consistently, we have Vipul Agrawal joining us. Vipul is a seasoned agile practitioner with over 20 years of experience in consulting, business analysis, and product management. He has been guiding financial institutes in their journey of adopting agile way of working. Vipul has been a coach and mentor over 1.5 decades. He has conducted training sessions on business analysis, business processes, agile documentation in India and abroad. He was also a visiting faculty of software engineering in one of the top B schools of India, Symbiosis. Vipul is an avid writer, and his articles have been published in many international magazines and portals. Vipul is a certified Scrum Master, Product Owner, and CFFI Agilist. He did his MBA from Symbiosis Center of Management and HRD. As we move on to the session, a quick request to all of you, please post your questions in Q&A box. We will take them up at the end of the session. Without further ado, join me in welcoming Vipul. Vipul is indeed a pleasure to have you join us today, and we look forward to learning from your experiences. Over to you, Vipul.
Thank you, Pratesh. Thanks for such a good introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you all of you to joining this webinar on a Saturday evening, which is always a very personal time. So I really appreciate everyone taking some time off and learning about what is becoming a very, very important skill for all the business analysts in the world, which is writing user stories. Before I start sharing the presentation, I would like to say that user stories has more or less become de facto way of capturing the requirements. So I'll start sharing my screen, and I'll start sharing the presentation. And as Pritesh said, if you have any questions, please put them in Q&A, and I'm going to take that at the end of the session. Right, without any further delays, let me share my screen. Right, so how to write compelling user stories? A question that probably every business analyst is asking each other in today's world. Let's see. But before we get into how to write a compelling user story, let's spend some time in understanding what really is a user story. What do we mean by user story? So let us see. Let's understand what is a user story. So what is a user story? Well, it is a requirement. It is a requirement which is written from perspective of an end user. And it also has certain acceptance criteria, which we are going to cover in further slides. But are user stories the only thing that is written by business analysts? Is user story too small block in your entire requirements management? Probably yes. So there are things which you have to write before you create a user story, which we call as epics. Now, epics are large body of work. They're a combination of user stories which will create one epic. But again, is epic the highest form of requirements? Probably not. So we may need to have something before epic, which we call as initiative. Now, if you go back to your old ways of doing things, we always used to have something called as outline business requirement, the highest level of your requirements. Then those outline business requirements were divided or broken down into something smaller, your high level requirements, which in today's world is epic. And each of those epics or high level requirements were broken down into smaller detail level requirements, which in today's world is user story. So you see, there is an initiative. Under initiative, you can have multiple epics, and under an epic, you can have multiple user stories. And all this is called as user story hierarchy. Not very different from what we used to do earlier, but certainly there are different names, and certainly there are different ways of capturing this. Now, I have taken a small example of flight booking, which is an initiative. Under flight booking, I have said there are two epics. There can be multiple epics, but for discussion purpose, I have just taken two, which is flight search and payment. And under each of these epics, you would have multiple user stories. And we will take an example to discuss that in further slides. Now, let's say how you actually write these user stories or initiatives or epics. Now, writing initiatives and epics are simple. So that's why I'm not going to spend much time there. It is simple, plain English. You just write, a sentence there. It's more like your business need, which is described in plain English. Epics are slightly smaller, but still mostly written in plain English. You may or may not want to write, some objectives under an epic or some success criteria under an epic, based on which you can decide whether the epic has been fulfilled or not. But that's not where we are spending most of the time. We are going to spend a lot more time in user stories. So let's see what is user story and how do we write a user story and what are the syntax of user story. So first, let's get into the syntax of user story. Now, this is something that you would have heard by many, which is as a I want to, so that. What is the significance of the syntax? The significance is as a user. So you have to define who is it who is asking for this user story? Who is it who is narrating this user story? Now, user can be a backend user, a front-end user, a end customer, anyone. So if you're talking about say an app, user can be you and me. But if you are looking at probably a contact center, a user can be a call center executive. User can be anyone. Then the question is, what is it that the user want? So in my case, I have said as a user, I want to select from and to city. So this is the requirement. This is what he wants to do. But in the earlier world, a user can give you a requirement without really justifying that why he is asking for this requirement. He had there were no ways to capture what is the justification. What is he going to do with that requirement? But in user story, he has to justify it. So the third line, which is so that. So he has to tell you that why is he asking for the requirement. Now, users are users. Business users are always very demanding. And they may ask you for requirements, which probably is not feasible, or it's not even requirement. It is their desire. It is their wish. And people can desire anything. But now with user stories, he or she has to tell you that why is he asking for it. And that's why you always have to use this format when you're writing a user story, which is as a user, I want to do XYZ so that, and that's where he wants to tell you that what is it he wants to achieve from this user story. But is the user story enough? Because at the end of the day, this user story captured by a business analyst need to be developed. It need to be created, converted into a system. And with this information, nobody can really develop it. So you need to give them more information. And let's see how you can give that more information. You can give them that information through what we call as acceptance criteria. Now, every user story must absolutely have acceptance criteria. There can be a single acceptance criteria or there can be multiple acceptance criteria. And there are various ways of writing acceptance criteria. But the most appropriate that I feel is what we call as the gherkin format. And it is, as I've mentioned in the slide, given, when, then. Now, given is a prerequisite. So you have to define what is the prerequisite or what is the entry criteria for this acceptance criteria. So in this case, if you look at the example, I have said, given I am on flight search page. So that's the prerequisite, that I have to be on the flight search page. That's my entry criteria, without which I cannot start. When is the action that the user is performing? So Here in the example, I have said when I select to and from city. That's one action that I have performed. But that's not the only action I need to perform. So there is one more action, which is I press search. So the user is performing two actions, and there can be more actions. This is more for a explanation purpose, but there can be more actions. Similarly, there can be more prerequisites. So given I am on flight search page and I have logged in, so there are prerequisites. So you can always use the word and there to add your prerequisite. But a word of caution for all of you. If you feel that there are just too many given, there are too many and under a given, or too many and under a when, that means your acceptance criteria is probably too large. And you need to break it down into smaller acceptance criteria. That is also one way of judging whether you are writing your user stories and acceptance criteria properly or not. Anything which you feel is too large needs to be broken down. Now, we have understood what is given. We have understood what is when, which is the action, which is actually the action performed by the user. And if a user is performing an action, then there has to be an outcome. So what is that outcome? And how do you capture that outcome? Is through then. So if we go through the acceptance criteria again, given a prerequisite, I am on flight page, search page, my prerequisite. When, my action, I select to and from city, and I press search. Then my outcome, what I expect from this whole user story is the flight details should be displayed. Now, if you look at this acceptance criteria, it is very easy for others to understand. It is very easy for the audience of the acceptance criteria to understand. Now, who is really the audience of this acceptance criteria? Who is the one who is going to look at this acceptance criteria? So now I know you can't answer this question to me, so I will answer it for you right now. It is the development team and the test team. So a developer is going to look at this acceptance criteria. Now he has all the information needed. He knows what is the prerequisite. He knows what are the actions that need to be performed by the user, and he also know what is the outcome. So he can develop this application based on these acceptance criteria. For the test team, again, the test team knows what is the prerequisite. The test team knows what is the action. The test team knows what is the outcome. So they can build their test cases based on this acceptance criteria. Now, many organizations use various tools like Agile Requirement Development, ARD. If your acceptance criteria are written in Gherkin format, the test team can actually just pick it up and create their test cases automatically. The tool will going to do that for them. So just imagine how much effort is reduced because you are writing your requirements in a user story format and you are writing your acceptance criteria in a Gherkin format. And acceptance criteria are the heart and soul of your user story. That is where you're defining each and every smaller aspect of your requirement. So whether it is your business rules, whether it is your validation rules, whether it is your data mapping rules, whether there is a data transformation being done, all that needs to be captured in your acceptance criteria. I will also like to add, while I am advocating Gherkin format, it is not mandatory, it is not must to write your acceptance criteria in your Gherkin format. if you feel appropriate. And that is where, we as business analysts need to understand these are all guidelines, these are all best practices. But if you still feel that Gherkin format is probably not the best way of writing the user story or writing the acceptance criteria, you can use some other format, or you can use plain English. It is purely up to you. But Gherkin format is more acceptable and more used across the world. So we have understood what is user stories. We have understood the syntax of user stories. We have understood syntax of acceptance criteria. And we have also understood who's the audience of these user stories and acceptance criteria. But what is more important for us is to know what really is a good user story. How do I write a good user story? How do I know the story that I have written is good enough? And there are various ways of judging that. So let's try and understand what and how of a good user story. Now, as I said earlier, user story is a building block. It's a building block of your requirements. And the most compelling user story is the one which adds value to the customer. If your user story is not adding value to the customer, then there is something wrong. Now, traditionally, the way we have worked is for a particular requirement. Let's say this is a user story. So I've just written the same user story. As I said, I'm going to take one user story and we'll discuss that in this session. If this user story has to be developed in, or were developed in a traditional way, what would happen first? Somebody will, create a UI or a web page, and he'll say that, yeah, no, you know what, I can do that in one sprint. Okay, fair enough. Then somebody else will say, right, now that the UI and web page is done, I'm going to do middleware, and I'm going to take another sprint. Sprint are usually 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Okay. Then somebody will say, okay, so now I can do the database, and I'm going to take another sprint. Now, if you look at it, one user story, and we have already talked about 3 sprints. So the customer is not able to really use this feature for 3 sprints. That's not really what we want. That's not the value that we want to add to the customer. Now, I'm not I'm not an artist, so I'm just trying to create this like a cake. But if you actually slice it and look at it, the way you should create your user story is your UI pages, your middleware, your database, everything should be done in a single sprint, which means end to end, you should be able to develop and deploy your user story. That is the gold standard for any user story. If you are able to do that in a single sprint, means that you have really created a good user story. So keep that in mind. A value can only be delivered to a customer when he can actually use the feature. And he can only use the feature when the feature is made available to him by developing it, by testing it, and by deploying it. Now, this concept of having a user story with all 3 layers of UI, web, middleware, and database being done in a single sprint is called as vertical slicing of stories. So try as much as possible to vertically slice your story to make sure that the story is just at the right size so that you can develop it, it can be deployed, And in today's world, DevOps, CI/CD actually enables you to deploy your code much quickly, test it. Now, we've discussed about the Gherkin format earlier. The test cases can be created quite quickly nowadays. So the technology is there, the processes are there for you to use them. But for you as business analysts, you have to ensure that your stories are created in such a way that it can be vertically sliced. That's, as I said, is one gold standard for you to see whether you're writing a good user story or not. But that's not enough. So a user story need to pass something called as invest. Now, invest is something which, again, a lot of organizations use worldwide to evaluate whether the story that has been written is, again, a good story or not. So let's understand what is invest. So I stands for independent. Each user story should be independent. It should not be dependent. And I'm sure most of you would ask me this question, that is it really possible? Can you have a story which is not dependent on any other story? And yes, that is not possible. So when I say a story has to be independent, it has to be independent in that sprint, the sprint in which the story has been taken. For a particular sprint, you cannot have stories which are dependent on something else. If that's happening, then either the story is still not ready to be moved into a sprint, or the story has not been written properly. So very important, the story needs to be independent. Next is negotiable. Now this is something very interesting, because earlier when we used to write requirements, we always used to say your requirement should be absolutely crystal clear. There should be no scope of ambiguity. There should be no scope of ifs and buts. And to achieve that, we used to spend hours and hours and hours to get even the smallest information. But by the time we capture all that information, things will change. And the user will come back and say that, you know what, I don't want this, I want that. And that is why user stories need not necessarily be absolutely 100% correct. There should be enough room in the story to negotiate, to improve, to enhance. Now, the user story that I created, I'm sure many of you would have seen that and said that, you know what, we can add this and that, we can add some more validation, we can add to and from date, we can add validation that the to date and the from date should not be from date should not be earlier than the to date. Absolutely, the user stories should leave just enough room for it to be enhanced further. That does not mean that you create an absolutely vague user story, because if you're creating a vague user story, that's not going to add value to the customer. So the third point is valuable. The user story should be valuable to the customer. The feature that you are capturing in your user story, the feature that you are developing for your user, the feature that you are giving to a user to use, should add value to him. If it is not adding value, then there is certainly something wrong with your user story. You need to look at it and rework on the user story. So this is all fine. It should be valuable, but then it should be estimable. Your developers, your testers, your development team should be able to estimate that user story, irrespective of what estimation techniques they use, whether they use story points or poker points or whatever it is. There are multiple ways of estimating your user stories, but they should have enough information to say that, yeah, I understand what the story is, and I can estimate the story based on the technique that we have agreed. So if they feel that the story is too large, and I'll give you an example. Most common way of estimating a user story is the story points. So you use the Fibonacci series 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Most of the organizations believe that any story which is estimated more than 8 probably needs some more work. So if your developers are saying, I don't understand this story, I don't think I have enough information to either estimate it, or because there are so many unknowns that I would like to estimate this user story as 13 or as 21, then that means your story is not right. It is not yet ready. You need to work on that story more. You probably need to break it down into smaller stories. You probably need to add a lot more information than it is there in that story. When I say information, means a lot more acceptance criteria you need to add. So your story should always be estimable. Small, we just discussed that. If your story is too large, if your story point is 8 or 13 or 21, probably it needs to be broken down further. So you certainly need to look at that. And last, this is all fine, but if you can't test your story, then it is of no use. You certainly need to create your user stories in such a way that it can be passed or failed. And your acceptance criteria are going to help you in evaluating your user story. So each of your user story should be pass or fail. Right. So that's how you create your user stories. That's how you do vertical slicing of your user stories. You create, invest, you look at your user stories, and you pass through your user stories through each and every aspect of invest. Now, let's take an example of a user story and judge whether this user story is going to pass the invest test or not. And I have just for the sake of discussion, I have just created a user story with some acceptance criteria. There can be multiple more acceptance criteria. So this is only for explanation purpose. So the first test under invest is independent. Is this user story independent in a particular sprint? So yes, it is independent. There is no dependency on anything else. There's no dependency on any other story. The search page is available. The drop down for city and to city and from city is there. The travel date is there. The search button is there. You don't have any dependency on identifying the list of cities, identifying the dates or search page. So it is independent. There is the developers don't have to wait for anything to start developing this. Negotiable. Is there a scope for enhancement in this story? Absolutely yes. There is some scope for enhancements. You can say travel date to and from. You can say just single one way or return. So there are definitely scope for negotiation in this story. Value. Is this story adding any value to the customer? And I would think it is, because it is giving a feature, a basic feature to get the flight options from one city to another for a particular date. So a user can actually use this feature. So it is adding some value to the customer. It may not be, the most fancy looking web page. It may not be the most uh, feature rich web page, but it is giving something to the customer and letting customer actually get the flight options. So what we call as, most viable product, MVP, or most marketable product, MMP. So this is giving it that value to create an MVP, most viable product, because this is and this has, scope for enhancement. So you can always iterate, create an enhanced version of that, which is the whole essence and ethos of your agile world. Estimable. Can the engineers define the level of effort needed? Yes, they can, because they have enough information to estimate. Is this small enough? I believe so, because it's a small feature, it's an independent feature, but still a developer can, develop this, a tester can test this within a single sprint. So it is certainly small enough to be taken in a single sprint. Last but not the least, and probably one of the most important ones, is testable. Is this story testable? So yes, a tester can actually look at the story, and when that story is developed, he can actually perform these actions, and he can expect an output. So he can certainly test it. So yes, it is testable. So in my view, I believe this story passes the invest test. The story also passes the vertical slicing, because you have your pages, you would have your middleware, you would have your database in place, and it can be developed, tested, and deployed in a single sprint. So this is just an example for you to understand how you can evaluate your stories based on two criterias: vertical slicing and invest. And these two, as I said, are one of the most widely used ways of evaluating a story in the world. They are pretty much gold standards. And if you are able to, if your story is able to pass through these two tests, then probably you have written a really good story. Now, there is another big question that comes to a lot of people's mind. And I think there is a huge confusion about what is the difference between acceptance criteria and definition of done. I hope most of you would have heard these two terms, acceptance criteria and definition of done. Now, to understand the difference, let's again go back, probably 15 years, 20 years back, where we used to hear some terminologies called quality assurance and quality control. Very popular. Everybody used to talk about quality. Everybody used to talk about quality assurance and quality control. What's quality assurance? Well, it ensures that there is a process defined. It was very process oriented. It prevents quality problems, right? And it also improves the development and test processes. So I'm emphasizing on the word process. So quality assurance would ensure that you have a process in place which can then produce some quality. But then what is quality control? And I will tell you why I'm talking about this in the for acceptance criteria and definition of done. A quality control was to ensure quality of the product. Now here's the key difference. Quality assurance is about process. Quality control is about product. Quality control is about identifying the defects. It is product oriented. So there is a difference. There is process for quality assurance. There is product for quality control. Your definition of done is similar to your quality assurance. So what is definition of done? It's a checklist. It's a checklist to tell you, have you done all this? Have you done peer review? Have the product owner seen the end product? Has the product owner agreed? Has the tester tested it? So there are checklists. If you are checked all those boxes, then only you can call your story as complete. So it's a definition of done. It's a process. Again, it's a process-oriented checklist. But your acceptance criteria, as we have discussed in the early part, actually tells you your requirements, your predefined requirements, your business rules, your validation rules. Your acceptance criteria is telling you what needs to be built. What are the requirements from the customer? Have I met all the requirements from the customer? And they both are independent, but to produce, to actually deploy a quality story or a quality feature, both acceptance criteria and definition of done should be met. While they are mutually exclusive, but they are as important as anything else. Now, for each story, and you would understand that for each story, acceptance criteria can vary, and it will vary because that's a requirement. So each story would have different acceptance criteria. But each story should undergo the same definition of done checklist. So once you have built something, you need to check whether you have built it correctly or not. And that's why your definition of done is build the product right, which means you're following the right processes to build the product. But your acceptance criteria is build the right product, which means that you have met all the customer requirements. You have met all the business rules. You have met all the validation rules. You have done all your business data mapping. So these are two very distinct concepts, and I have seen many articles where people use acceptance criteria and definition of done interchangeably. But believe me, in my experience, they are completely two different things with completely two different objectives. So anybody who tells you that they are same, I think the first way to counter that is you cannot have acceptance criteria same as for all the stories. It has to be different because those are requirements. And you cannot have different definition of dones for different stories because that's process. Every story should undergo the same process. So I would stop here, and probably I will just spend another minute or so to talk a few more things about the stories, and then I will open the floor for any questions. And I see there are a lot of questions and a lot of hands raised. I have shared a certain format of user story, which is, as a I want to so that. And more often than not, I've been asked this question: what if I'm building a middleware project, a system? What if I'm building a database or a backend project? There is no user. They are all systems. How do I then write a user story with defining as a user? And that's a very, very valid question. So there are a few other ways of writing your user stories, though it was not scope of today's discussion, but I would still mention it to you so that you can go back and read a little bit on it. So there is a format called feature-driven development. Now, feature-driven development talks about the features. It doesn't really talk about a user journey or a user story. And a lot of you, if you're working on any middleware or backend projects, it would be very helpful for you to look at these feature-driven development formats for your user stories and for your acceptance criteria. So uh, maybe if anybody wants to discuss more about it, they can connect with me offline. But it's another very good way of capturing your user stories without being restricted of identifying a user. But if you don't feel like doing that and you still want to continue with as a user, you always have an option of creating a persona. So if you're talking about a middleware system, you can create that system as a user, or you can create, for example, if you're looking at a payments system, you can create payment as a persona, and you can use that persona for purpose of users. You can always say as a payment, and nobody can really question that, because it's your way. I mean, it's your way of identifying a user, even though there is no real user in it. So that's what I wanted to cover from a presentation point of view. I would now open the floor for any questions, and I'll be happy to answer. I can see there are a lot of questions and a lot of hands raised, so probably it's good to spend time on that. So over to you, Pritesh.
Thank you, Vipul. Is really very crisp and to the point, and really helpful learning experience with this session. So we have few questions. So let me put it. So first question we got is like, how many acceptance criteria should be there in a user story?
Okay, I think that's a very, very good question. There is no rule behind it that how many acceptance criteria should be there in a user story. But my experience is, if you have a user story with more than probably 4 to 5 acceptance criteria, then probably the user story is large, and you wouldn't like to break it into two. But having said that, it also depends on how you have captured your acceptance criteria. If you're capturing very, very minute details, then you may land up having a lot of acceptance criteria. And I'll give you an example. For example, if you are, if there are two systems and there is an interface, and you know that there is data, there are 10 data fields, or there are say 20 data fields, which need to be converted or transformed into a different format. One way of writing acceptance criteria is to write each and every data field, and that if you have 20 data fields, and you are practically talking about 20 acceptance criteria, straightforward. Or you can always create an Excel sheet separately, and you can link your criteria to that spreadsheet, and you can say that, given I have received this data, when the system is reading the data, then transform the data based on the spreadsheet, and you can give the link of that spreadsheet. So, but 4 to 5 acceptance criteria per user story seems to be the right number.
Yeah, and one more question we have, like, what not to cover in the acceptance, because sometimes what happen, like engineering team want each and every minute or like a point to be covered in the acceptance criteria. So if you give the some insight on what not to cover as part of user story.
I think it's again a very good question. What not to cover in acceptance criteria? So first, I would just say what you should certainly cover. You should certainly cover your happy path and unhappy path, which means all your negative scenarios should be covered as part of your acceptance criteria. Or what should not be covered is solution, is your technology solution. So if your engineers are asking for what kind of SQL query would be there, what kind of interface specifications will be there, what kind of URL has to be created. Those kind of information you should not be covering as part of your user stories. You need to still remember that user stories are requirements. They are still business requirements, and business requirement should be independent of a technology solution, or what kind of technology you're using. So anything which is related to technology solution should ideally not be covered in acceptance criteria.
Yeah. So one more next question is we have like sometime like if feature we are developing, like as you said, like it should be the cake piece, not the cake slice. Uh, to if your feature is dependent on the other feature, in this case, how we are going to deal with that?
So if your story is dependent on some other story, and you feel that it is not vertically sliced, then that story is not ready to be taken into sprint. Any story that is, so as I said earlier when I was talking about vertical slicing, you cannot have a scenario where a story is not dependent on anything in your backlog, but the story should be independent when it is taken into the sprint. So if your story is still dependent on some other story, then it is not ready to be taken into the sprint, and you need to work, or you need to refine that story further. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. And one more question: how to deal with NFR using user stories?
Brilliant question, absolutely brilliant question. And I think most of us really struggle to create NFRs in a user story format. Now, there are various debates on that. My personal view is NFR should be part of the acceptance criteria, and many organizations deal with NFRs differently. Some organizations have very predefined NFRs. If that is the case, then you can't capture it as part of your acceptance criteria. You need to probably link your story into the specific NFRs that have been issued by your organization. But if not, and if you have to capture the NFRs on your own, so for example, the story that we have created, now the search return, after we press the search button, the page should display the search return, say within 0.01 second. Now that's a non-functional requirement, and that can be captured as part of your acceptance criteria.
We are getting we are getting lot of queries, but due to time constraint, we can take the last question. Last question is like apart from acceptance criteria and user story description, how we can cover or assumption, constraint, screen flow, and process flow as part of user story.
Again, this is a very, very good question. And let's start with business processes first. So business processes are high level processes. All your stories that you have created, user stories, should be aligned with your business processes. If we take a process and if we say that there is a block in that, now that block in a business process can be represented either a single user story or multiple user stories. It all depends on how you have defined your business processes. There are various tools which can link your business processes to your user stories, or you can manually do that. So for example, if you're looking at something like Jira and Confluence, in Confluence you can create your business process and you can link your Jira stories with Confluence. So that's your business processes that you can cover and link your user stories to. There were other things like risk and constraints and assumptions. If you have assumptions, especially assumptions, then if there are too many assumptions, then obviously your user story is still not ready to be taken into the sprint. That means it needs further refinement. But if there is an assumption that is fairly comfortable, or business is fairly comfortable with, it's a good idea to capture it as part of your description of the user story. So you can always say, once you have written your user story, below that you can always write certain assumptions. Risk are again something, each organization has their own way of documenting the risk. uh, Many tools like Jira gives you a facility to create a risk separately, and then tag that risk to the story created in Jira. Or if you are there's a dependency, or the story is blocked, Jira has the facility to actually raise it as an impediment flag, so that that the story is blocked and it cannot be moved forward. But from a documentation point of view, it is purely up to you whether you want to capture everything as part of the story, or you want to create as separate risk sheet and separate assumption sheet and separate dependency sheet, and then link them together. I prefer to keep them separate, because then they are mutually independent, but you can always link them. And if there is any change in any of those, you don't have to go and change it in different areas. So that's why I prefer to have them separate, but then get linked.
So one more question for the like who is turning to the VA as a newly person, then how he can he she can define like this is he or understand to develop a good user story.
How to write a good user story is all about practice, practice, and practice. You cannot expect that I write a good user story now, and I will continue to write good user stories. Each user story has to be good and has to go through the invest and vertical slice evaluation. And the only way you can write good user stories is you keep writing them, you keep practicing it, you keep improving it. Identify what are the gaps that you had in the previous user story, and try to fill those gaps in the next user story. And never, never, never expect that once you have written a user story, then it is casted in stone. Always remember, in invest, the second most important point is negotiable, which means that there is a scope of enhancing the user story. So when you're writing a user story, go with a frame of mind that there can be further enhancement, there can be further improvement in that user story.
One more question we have, like, which is a more thing like how to differentiate for best practices for handling the technical user stories.
See, in an ideal world, there shouldn't be technical user stories, because everything should be driven by business requirements. But that doesn't really happen. So people do write technical user stories. And I would say the technical user stories should follow the same format as your business user story. Each technical user story should have a very definite value that it is deriving. It should be small. It should be independent. It should have estimable, and more importantly, it should have a very defined outcome. That what are you trying to achieve? So your acceptance criteria, while you may not write acceptance criteria in Gherkin format, because Gherkin format is more business driven format, but you still should have very clear acceptance criteria for your technical user story, and those acceptance criteria should be met before you say that my user story has been completed. What I also suggest everyone to differentiate your user stories and technical user stories through using some kind of syntax. So for example, you may at the start of a user story, you may write business user story and technical user story, or some abbreviations like BUS or TUS, or business story or technical story. So that you have, as soon as you look at the story, you know that okay, this is a technical user story, or this is a business user story.
One one more. Can the user story be different for the same requirement?
Can the user story be different for the same requirement? User story is the requirement. So how a user story would be different for the same requirement? Now, if you're asking me, should there be a negative user story and a positive user story for a particular requirement, then my answer would be that it should be a single user story, but you should have your acceptance criteria covering both happy path and unhappy path, or your successful scenarios and unsuccessful scenarios.
And one more query regarding the like how to write non-performance requirement acceptance criteria.
How to write non-performance? I need to understand a little more. What do you mean by non-performance? So if you're asking about NFRs, which are not related to performance NFRs like scalability and usability, but you're looking more like towards probably regulatory NFRs or SLAs, then it should be captured as part of your acceptance criteria. If you're looking at, for example, the colors, or if it's a web page and you're looking at usability or look and feel, or your UX, user design, user experience, NFRs, those should also be captured as part of your acceptance criteria. If you don't have, predefined acceptance criteria which are applicable to all the user stories.
Just we'll take last two questions. Where like one question: if there are 50 rules in the user stories in the sprint, should all of them need to be there in the acceptance criteria, or do you think only important rules need to be there in the acceptance criteria?
Now, all the rules should be there as acceptance criteria. Now, whether that is a single user story or those are multiple user stories are left on the business analyst judgment. And also, as I said, if you feel that there are 50 rules, but there are really smaller rules, and it can be captured as part of a mapping sheet or part of a spreadsheet, and that can be linked into your acceptance criteria. So that's also fine, but it is more judgment of a business analyst to define or to design your user story. But you cannot miss any of your rules, because even a small rule missed means that you have not met your user's requirement.
And the last question is like regarding the reporting, how to break down complex report specifications that can be meaningful. Like for example, CRM data report specification have many calculation within the table, and sometimes more than one table also within a report.
So if you have reports which are really large, and there are there are multiple calculations, again you need to identify that can those reports be broken down into smaller meaningful functions. What is the objective of the report? Who's the audience of the report? And can that report be broken down into, as I said earlier, into smaller chunks? So for example, if you're talking about sales report, now sales report can be broken down into various ways, right? In a report, number of rows is not important, because that's what would be done by the system. What is important is that what are business rules behind those reports? What is the frequency of the report? So think of a report as from a business analyst point of view, think the report as a template, as an empty report without any data, because the data, once you look at the data can be thousands or lakhs of data, but that does not really make any difference to you as a business analyst. So define your report more from a business perspective, understand how can you break it down into smaller pieces, and then when all those 3 or 4 user stories based on your reports are created, it will generate your full report. But having said that, you also need to understand that if you're breaking it into smaller pieces, then each of that piece should have some valuable insights and valuable information for the audience of that report.
Like, who can update the user story written based on the iteration or grooming feedback received from the engineering team?
So the user story is the responsibility of the business analyst. It is irrespective of who is giving the feedback. It is the business analyst who should be updating those user stories. Any changes done, engineer or an architect should approach the business analyst to give him the changes. And if you accept and you agree that these changes are valid, then you can do it. But yes, it's a business analyst's responsibility.
Yeah. Thanks, Vipul, for answering all the queries and this wonderful session. Dear attendees, as you exit, please share your feedback by responding to the brief questionnaire. Thank you. Over to Sanjay.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Thank you, Pritesh. Vipul, I have reserved one last question for you.
Yep.
And I think quite a few of our attendees might be interested in that.
Mhm.
This is taking into account your background.
Mhm.
What is the importance of a business analysis background as somebody progresses to a product owner? You are a product owner, and that's why I'm posing this very pointed question to you. A lot of our business analysts have gotten very interested in product ownership areas. So, how does it help?
So I can start by saying that product owner role is a progression for every business analyst. It's a very logical progression for any business analyst. Now, and just before you have asked this question, there was a question about who can change the user story. So while the role of the product owner is to manage the product backlog, is to look at the user stories and understand how he can prioritize the user stories. And how he does that is by interacting with the business, by interacting with the technology team, by interacting with other stakeholders, and by interacting with the development team. So his skill sets are: he need to understand the business, he need to have the know-how of the technology, he need to know the requirements to the level that he can actually prioritize the requirements and see if there is a value being delivered from that story. And on top of that, he's the one who has the overall accountability of delivering a valuable product to the customer. Now, if you look at all these skill sets, a business analyst, when he starts his career, he learn all this over the period of time. He understands the business with the virtue of he interacting with the development team day in and day out. He understands, he has the know-how of the technology. There's no better person than a business analyst to know how to deal with the stakeholders and whether the requirement that is being delivered is adding any value to the customer. So your background of business analyst helps you a lot to be a product owner. I have seen product owners who doesn't come with the business analyst background, and then there are people like me who have been a business analyst for last 2 decades and then started working as a product owner. And I can clearly see that I have a lot more advantage over others because I understand business, I understand technology, I understand user stories, I understand requirements, and all this will help me in the most important thing that a product owner does, which is delivering value to the customer.
I will pick up on one item,
Yes.
that one critical item which stuck out for me as a business analyst. What is the value of me knowing technology? I don't have to be a programmer, but I have to know what technology can deliver to business. My business users might not be in that position. So that is one message I would like to leave our listeners with. Please do a little bit deep dive into technology to understand the power of technology we are playing with. We are part technologists. We are interfacing with our business users. It's up to us also to guide them as to what more technology can deliver from them beyond their only user requirements.
Absolutely, Sanjay. And I would probably like to add another point to that is gone are the days where you would write all the requirements then you will hand it over to somebody to work on it. Now it is all about collaboration. You sit with the engineers to actually, develop that requirement, develop your user stories, and your engineers is going to talk mostly technology. So you need to understand, really need to understand, what they are saying, what they are speaking, what language they are speaking, whether it is cloud, whether it is, workflow systems, whether it is, databases. You should have a know-how of what they are speaking, because then only you could have a meaningful conversation, and then only you can really, develop your or refine your user stories, which is understood by you as business and by your engineering team as technology. That's my last point.
No, thank you very much. We have still got a lot of unanswered questions, and I will send them across to you, hoping you will give written responses so that I can share with our listeners and attendees today. Thank you very much, Vipul. It's been a very interesting pleasure and a very interesting session, and look forward to more interactions with you as time progresses. Thank you once again. Take care and have a good weekend.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you very much.